Marcus Chen stood frozen in the marble lobby of his headquarters, his heart pounding as he watched the small boy's trembling hands form signs he hadn't seen in 3 years, not since the day his own daughter passed away on. Child's desperate eyes locked onto his as those little fingers spelled out a message that made his blood run cold. Help me. He has a weapon. But Marcus's late daughter, Emma, had taught him that sign language was more than words. It was emotion and context. And as he looked closer at the frightened 8-year-old boy standing beside a man who was swaying unsteadily near the reception desk, Marcus realized with a jolt that the sign he'd interpreted as weapon was actually the child's frantic attempt to sign medicine. The gestures were similar, both involving a pointed finger and urgent motion, but this child's unpracticed hands were shaking too hard to be precise. Marcus rushed forward, his CEO persona dropping away as he knelt beside the boy and signed back, "What's wrong? I can help." And the child's eyes widened in shock and relief as tears spilled down his cheeks, and he signed back in broken, elementary gestures, "My daddy, sick, sugar low, need help. Please, mister." And Marcus immediately understood the man was diabetic and experiencing hypoglycemic shock. "Call 911. Marcus shouted to his security team as he caught the swaying father just before he collapsed, easing him to the floor while the boy sobbed and clutched his father's hand. And Marcus grabbed the orange juice from his own briefcase. He always carried it, a habit from when Emma had a diabetic friend, and carefully helped the semi-conscious man drink small sips while signing reassurances to the terrified child. "He'll be okay. Help is coming. You're very brave." The paramedics arrived within minutes, and as they stabilized the father, Marcus learned from the boy, whose name was Oliver, that they'd come to the building because his dad, James, had a job interview on the 3rd floor, his first interview in 8 months after being laid off from the factory, and James hadn't eaten breakfast because they'd run out of food at home, and he'd given the last of the cereal to Oliver, and the stress and low blood sugar had triggered the crisis. As the ambulance prepared to leave, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He rode with them to the hospital, this billionaire CEO in his $1,000 suit sitting beside a frightened child who clutched his hand and signed "thank you" over and over. And during that ambulance ride, Marcus saw Emma in Oliver's eyes, remembered all the times his daughter had felt different and scared because the world didn't understand her silent language. And he'd been so consumed with building his empire that he'd missed her last school play, her last birthday, and then suddenly, she was gonna brain aneurysm, unexpected and devastating, and he'd never forgiven himself for choosing board meetings over bedtime stories. At the hospital, James regained full consciousness, and the gratitude and shame in his eyes as he looked at his son nearly broke Marcus's heart. This was a good father in terrible circumstances, and Marcus asked the hospital social worker for privacy and sat with James and Oliver in the recovery room. And James explained through exhausted tears that he'd been raising Oliver alone since his wife died in childbirth, that he'd learned some sign language because Oliver had a deaf best friend named Tyler at school and wanted to communicate with him, that they'd been evicted from their apartment last week and were staying in his car, that he'd been so desperate to get this job that he'd ignored his body's warnings. And Oliver had tried to tell the receptionist what was happening, but she couldn't understand his signs and had started to call security, thinking they were causing trouble, which was when the boy had seen Marcus across the lobby and noticed him instinctively sign good morning to himself, a habit Marcus had kept from his years of constant signing with Emma, and Oliver had recognized those gestures had made his desperate plea. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, the wall he'd built around his grief since losing Emma, and he looked at this brave boy who'd fought so hard to save his father, using a language he barely knew. And he made a promise to himself that this would not be just another charitable donation or anonymous good deed. This would be personal. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He stepped back from his company, delegated his meetings, and personally helped James and Oliver rebuild their lives. He arranged for them to stay in a corporate apartment his company maintained. He ensured James got proper medical care and a continuous glucose monitor. He had his assistant stock their kitchen with healthy food, and most importantly, he spent time with them, teaching Oliver proper sign language in evening sessions that became the highlight of Marcus's days. And in teaching this child, he felt close to Emma again, felt her presence in every hand, shape, and gesture. And he told Oliver stories about his daughter, showing him pictures, and Oliver listened with the wise, compassionate eyes of a child who understood loss. James didn't get the job he'd originally interviewed for. That position had been filled, but Marcus did something better. He created a new position in his company's community outreach division, a role that matched James's background in logistics and his passion for helping others, with a salary that could support his family and health benefits that covered his medical needs. And James was terrified it was charity, but Marcus looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not giving you anything you won't earn. I'm giving you the chance I wish someone had given you months ago, before you ended up in that lobby, and I'm doing it because your son reminded me what courage looks like, and because I have the power to help, and I'm tired of letting fear stop me from actually connecting with people." The transformation wasn't just in James and Oliver's circumstances, it was in Marcus himself, who started the Emma's Voice Foundation in his daughter's memory, a program that provided free sign language classes to families, schools, and businesses, and Oliver became the foundation's first student teacher, assisting in children's classes alongside Marcus. And the joy in that child's face as he helped other kids learn to communicate was a healing balm to Marcus's grieving heart. 6 months later, on what would have been Emma's 14th birthday, Marcus organized a special event at his Campania sign language performance of "You Are My Sunshine," Emma's favorite song, performed by 50 children from the Foundation's program. And as Oliver stood in the front row, his hands moving with growing confidence through the lyrics, Marcus stood in the back of the auditorium with tears streaming down his face, and James stood beside him and quietly said, "You know, that day in your lobby, I thought we'd hit rock bottom. I was so ashamed that my son had to watch me collapse, that I'd failed to take care of myself, that we had nothing left, but you saw us, really saw us, when everyone else just saw a problem to be removed, and you didn't just throw money at us. You gave us your time, your stories, your grief, and that's what actually saved us, not the apartment or the job, but the fact that you treated us like we mattered." Marcus couldn't speak, could only watch his daughter's legacy come alive in the graceful movements of 50 pairs of hands, and he realized that he'd spent 3 years running from his pain, burying himself in work, avoiding anything that reminded him of Emma. But Oliver's desperate signs in that lobby had shattered his isolation and pulled him back into the world of feeling, connection, and purpose. After the performance, Oliver ran to Marcus and signed with perfect clarity, "Did I make Emma proud?" And Marcus signed back, "He made her live again," and the boy hugged him with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. And Marcus hugged him back. This child who wasn't his daughter but who had somehow helped him remember how to be the father Emma had deserved. The story could have ended there, a neat resolution of rescue and gratitude. But life is rarely that simple, and 2 months later, James came to Marcus's office with Oliver and a look of nervous determination, and he said, "I need to tell you something. I've been offered a position in Seattle, a really good opportunity, with my former mentor who's starting a nonprofit for food security, and it's something I'm passionate about, and I wanted you to hear it from me before I made any decisions." Marcus felt the instinctive clutch of loss he'd grown attached to these weekly dinners with James and Oliver, these sign language sessions, this makeshift family that had formed in the wake of crisis. But he looked at James's hopeful, conflicted face and Oliver's worried eyes, and he knew what Emma would have wanted him to say. "Is this what's best for you and Oliver? Will it make you happy?" James nodded slowly. "I think it might be, but we'd be leaving you, And after everything you've done, Marcus interrupted, you don't owe me your life, James, you owe me your honesty and your happiness. And if Seattle is where you need to be, then I'll help you get there, and we'll stay connected, because that's what families do. The goodbye 3 weeks later was brutal and beautiful. Oliver had made Marcus a photo album filled with pictures from their time together, each page decorated with hand-drawn sign language alphabets. And James gave Marcus a framed photograph of the three of them at the foundation's opening day. And Marcus gave Oliver a leather journal that had belonged to Emma, filled with her sketches and thoughts. And he told the boy, she would have loved you, and she would have wanted you to have this. To know that your voice, whether signed or spoken or drawn, matters and should be preserved. At the airport, Oliver signed, will I ever see you again? And Marcus signed back, every summer, I promise, and anytime you need me, I'm just a video call away. And as he watched them walk toward security, James carrying their modest bags, and Oliver turning back every few steps to wave, Marcus felt grief and gratitude, in equal measure grief, for the temporary nature of all beautiful things, and gratitude that he'd been brave enough to let these people matter to him. 6 months passed, filled with weekly video calls where Oliver excitedly showed Marcus his new school and his expanded signing vocabulary and the garden he and his dad were growing. And Marcus threw himself into expanding the foundation, hiring 3 full-time coordinators, partnering with schools across the state, and personally teaching a class every Wednesday evening. That became known as the CEO's signing hour, and he discovered that vulnerability and authenticity were not weaknesses in leadership, but strengths that inspired loyalty and purpose in his employees. And his company's culture began to shift from cutthroat competition to collaborative community. Then, one rainy November evening, Marcus received a video call from Oliver, whose face was bright with excitement as he signed and spoke simultaneously. Marcus, guess what? Dad is getting married to Miss Rachel from the food bank, and they want you to come to the wedding. And Marcus, she has a daughter, and her daughter is deaf, and her name is Sophie, and she's teaching me poetry in ASL, and Dad says you have to be there because you're family. Marcus felt a complex wash of emotions, joy for James's new beginning, a whisper of sadness that their little trio was expanding and changing, an overwhelming love for this child, who still considered him family despite the distance, and new relationships. And he immediately booked his flight to Seattle, and on a crisp December day, he stood in a small community center, decorated with strings of lights and winter flowers, and he watched James marry a kind-faced woman whose hands moved in fluent ASL as she spoke her vows, and he watched Oliver stand proudly as the ring bearer, and he met 7-year-old Sophie, who shyly signed hello, and then asked if he was the Marcus who started Emma's voice, because her mom had shown her videos of the performances. And Marcus realized with a start that his daughter's legacy had reached further than he'd ever imagined, touching lives in cities he'd never visited. At the reception, James pulled Marcus aside and said, I need you to know something. When I was lying on that marble floor in your lobby, barely conscious, I heard Oliver crying, and I heard your voice telling him everything would be okay. And I made a promise to myself that if I survived, I would never again let pride or shame stop me from asking for help or accepting kindness. And I would raise my son to be like you, someone who sees people in crisis and runs toward them instead of away. And meeting Rachel, building this life, it's all because you taught me that accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom, and that the measure of a man isn't whether he falls, but whether he lets people help him stand back up. Marcus embraced this man who had become a true friend, and he said, You've got it backwards. You and Oliver saved me from a life of isolation and regret. You gave me a reason to sign again, to feel again, to remember that Emma's death doesn't have to be the end of her impact on the world. And the two men stood there, both fathers who'd loved and lost and found unexpected grace in the rubble of their broken places. During the father-daughter dance, Marcus watched James dance with both Sophie and Oliver, this blended family moving together in joyful, imperfect harmony, and Rachel approached him and signed, "Thank you for being part of their story. Oliver talks about you constantly. And James says you're the reason he believes in goodness again." And Marcus signed back, "They're the reason I believe in purpose again." And he meant it with every fiber of his being. As the evening wound down, and children chased each other between tables, and Oliver taught Sophie's hearing, cousins basic signs, and laughter filled the small hall, Marcus stepped outside into the cold Seattle night and looked up at the stars. And he spoke to his daughter the way he did every night. "Emma, sweetheart, I hope you can see this. I hope you know that your life, even though it was too short, created ripples that are still spreading. And I promise I won't waste the years I have left. I'll keep teaching, keep connecting, keep running toward people instead of away from them. And I'll love you forever." Back inside, Oliver found him and took his hand and led him to the dance floor where the DJ was playing a slow song, and the boy signed, "Will you dance with me? Dad's dancing with Sophie and Rachel, and I want to dance with you." And Marcus's throat tightened as he nodded and took the child's hands. And they swayed awkwardly, this polished CEO and this brave boy. And Oliver looked up at him and said, "You know what? I think that day in the lobby, when I signed to you, I think Emma helped me. I think she made sure you understood, because I was so scared and my hands were shaking. But somehow you knew exactly what I needed, and I think that's because she was watching out for both of us." And Marcus nodded because he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. And he thought about all the moments of chance and choice that had led to this instant, his decision to learn sign language when Emma was diagnosed as profoundly deaf at age 2, his habit of signing to himself, his presence in the lobby that particular morning, his choice to ride in the ambulance instead of returning to his meeting, his willingness to let strangers become family, and he understood that grief could either close us or crack us open, and he'd been closed for 3 years until a terrified child's imperfect signs had shattered his walls and let the light back in. When Marcus returned home to his city the next day, he didn't go back to his empty penthouse apartment. Instead, he went to the cemetery where Emma was buried, and he sat beside her headstone and told her everything about the wedding, about Oliver's happiness, about Sophie and the growing foundation and the hundreds of children learning to sign. And he said, "I'm not okay. Baby girl, I miss you every single day. And there's a hole in my heart that will never completely heal, but I'm living again, really living, and I think you'd be proud of that. And I promise to keep finding ways to turn this pain into purpose, to make sure your silence speaks louder than my grief." He sat there until the sun set, and then he drove to the Foundation's community center, where his Wednesday evening class was waiting. 15 adults of all ages who were learning to sign for various reasons. The grandfather whose granddaughter was deaf, a teacher who wanted to include all students, a young woman whose brother had lost his hearing in an accident, a retired nurse who just wanted to learn something beautiful, and Marcus taught them with patience and passion. And at the end of class, he told them the story of the day in the lobby, of the misunderstood signs, and the desperate child, and the unconscious father. And he told them, sign language saved a life that day. But more than that, it connected to broken families, and reminded me that we're all just trying to communicate our needs, our fears, our love, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is slow down and really see each other, really listen with our eyes and our hearts, and respond with compassion instead of judgment. And his students nodded with understanding in their eyes. And Marcus realized that this classroom, this community, this ongoing choice to teach and connect and stay vulnerable, this was his path forward, the road that led through grief instead of around it. Years passed, and the foundation grew into a national program, and Oliver grew into a young man who studied social work and ASL interpretation, and Marcus grew older with purpose etched into every line on his face, and on the 10th anniversary of Emma's death, he stood before an audience of 2,000 people at the Foundation's gala, and he signed and spoke simultaneously. My daughter taught me that communication is love made visible, and a frightened boy in a lobby taught me that the courage to ask for help and the willingness to give it are two sides of the same grace. And together they taught me that our worst moments can become doorways to our most authentic lives if we're brave enough to walk through them. And the audience rose in applause, hands waving in the air in the ASL sign for applause, a silent ovation that Emma would have seen and understood. And Marcus felt her presence in that moment, felt her approval, and he knew with certainty that his life had been cracked open by loss, but rebuilt by love, and that the signs he'd learned to communicate with his daughter had become the language through which he'd found his truest self. In the end, it wasn't about the weapon that never existed, or the crisis in the marble lobby, or even the dramatic rescue. It was about the choice to see, to stay, to connect, to let a stranger's pain matter enough to change your life. And Marcus understood that every day we stand in lobbies of our own making, watching people struggle, and we choose whether to turn away or step forward, whether to misunderstand or seek clarity, whether to protect our comfort or risk our hearts. And the difference between a life of meaning and a life of regret often comes down to that single moment of choice. That decision to sign back when someone is desperately asking for help, to say, I see you, I understand, you matter, and I will not let you fall alone.